This podcast is made possible by Planful. Hello, on today's episode of Planning Aces, we'll be featuring the FP&A insights and commentary of four finance leaders, including CFO Glenn Hopper of Sandline Global, CFO Adam Swizicki of Brex, CFO Peter Walker of Sterling, and CFO Peter Bedell of Lendio. This is Jack Sweeney, your co-host, along with top consultant Steve Player, who will serve as our co-host and resident thought leader as we seek to highlight the takeaways from our distinguished group of Planning Aces. We begin after this. In an ever-changing world, it can be tough to keep up with the latest FP&A trends and innovations that keep you ahead of the game. Luckily, there's a podcast for that. Tune in to Being Planful, the podcast for finance leaders and planning experts, and stay in the know about what's happening in planning and forecasting. Guests like influencer Chris Ortega, Boston Red Sox CFO Tim Zhu, and Brian Lapidus of AFP will keep you up to speed on how you can put finance in the driver's seat this year. Find the full episodes at beingplanful.com or wherever you get your podcasts. P.S. Think you might make a great guest on the show? Shoot host Rowan Tonkin an email at beingplanful@planful.com. Hi, it's Jack Sweeney. I'm here with Steve Player. Steve, I have to say, I like your office environment there. You know, the emphasis on communal work, sort of that open environment, shared workspaces rather than segregated offices.
Well, Robin is over there in her cubicle, and there's a whole set of cubes around us here, and we have cubes. We have cubes. We have offices. We have a big, small classroom next door. We have the big event room back there. If anybody wants to see that, they can go online to the Town of Addison council meetings, and they can hear the presentations, and that all comes from the event center behind us here. So, yeah, it's a multi-purpose facility.
Well, did you see how Adam Newman of WeWork fame is back raising money again? He's got a new, like a real estate company that has a digital wallet for crypto. I don't really understand it, to be perfectly honest, but he raised something like $350 million already.
Oh, yeah, I saw that article. I thought that was crazy.
Well, it says here he's got 3,000 multifamily units for this new venture, whatever that means.
It shows fools are born again and again and again. So I would love to somebody come through with not an idea, but actually a proven business plan, you know? So some real revenues every once in a while.
Also, have you noticed behind me, I have adorned my office wall with a new Remington.
No, I'm new to your office. If it's a Remington, it can't be new.
Yeah, I'll let you in on a little secret too. It's actually a print. It's called Stampede by Lightning. I love this one.
Well, when you come down here to Dallas-Fort Worth area, you need to go over to Fort Worth to the Amon Carter Museum. And the Amon Carter is full of Remington and Russells.
I actually think I have a book on Charles Russell from Amon Carter. I was never there, but I guess they publish a number of art books featuring their masterpieces.
It is the hotbed. It has been the long time jewel of, well, Fort Worth's got a lot of jewels. It's the biggest small town in America, even though it's probably top 20 in the country.
Interestingly, one visit to Texas where I got to see some of the Remington sculptures, bronzes up close, was at the EDS headquarters, was in Plano at the time, back in the 90s. And I had the opportunity to interview their CEO at the time. It was Les Aberthal. But you walk in
and to like the C-suite area, the upper management area, and it's filled with pieces of artwork from Remington. Anyway, I think that might have been a legacy of the Ross Perot era, perhaps. I don't know about that, but
Well, yeah, Perot was quite a collector, though. You are absolutely correct. And I've been in that office. I've never been to the C-suite of it, but I interviewed once. Almost took a job there. When I was about at one point when I was going to leave Anderson, I had accepted a job there to help them launch their financial. They were moving heavily into financial consulting, and I had literally had accepted a job, and for a short period of time, that was my revised career path until Anderson decided they really did want a costing practice, and I was the man that should be leading it. So then I had two good offers, and I had to figure out which one I was going to do. I stayed with Anderson because Anderson was known as a cost to do cost accounting work. Perot was not. EDS was not. And I realized I validated my decision when I went back looking on the history of Arthur Anderson's practice, and I quit looking when I saw the original announcement December 1st, 1913, when the firm of Anderson and Delaney announced they were opening practice to do several things, the fifth one of which was cost accounting studies. And so Anderson had been doing cost accounting since the founding of the firm.
well, I actually have a cost accounting question for you. But you know what? I'll hold off. I'll tease our listeners with it. I'll ask it a bit later in the podcast here. Right now, I want to ask you about our lineup, Steve, and the Planning Aces will be featuring this episode. What did you make of this month's lineup?
Well, it's interesting, Jack, because they cover a lot of different kind of key thoughts and things. I mean, you pick four, which was good because there's a huge trove of information, but it crosses the spectrum. And as we move further into kind of episode, we're getting episode, season 2, if you will. It's interesting as we begin to pick up new themes and things to move forward. And I think that's what our listeners can look forward to is as we continue to expand the themes and the things we're talking about. FP&A is as hot as it's ever been, probably in the history of the practice. But that means that we're getting deeper. We're going beyond. And so it's interesting how some of these things still dwell on the things that we've known, but bring new light and new advances. And I think that's one of the things we'll pick up out of these four speakers. And that's kind of the reason I like the breadth of being able to pull from all your CFO thought leaders and select the best to kind of pull forward from. So.
Okay, well, let's tee up our first planning ace, Steve, who is going to be Glenn Hopper, who is CFO of Sandline Global. If we go back to episode 819, one of the interesting things about Glenn was how he originally acquired his finance skill set. He, in fact, was a product manager. He was a product manager who really set himself apart by being able to explain the allocation of marketing dollars on his product and the impact they made. So much so that the marketing brass in the company started including him in meetings where they had to, build the argument for more marketing dollars. Let's have Glenn sit in. He can help us explain it well. Anyway, this is Glenn Hopper, CFO of Sandline Global.
So right now, a lot of our time is looking back to, okay, well, this is our budget. This is our performance to budget. This is how we did same period last year. Our gross margin is 24% this month. It was 23% that last month. And that's because we had this bump in, this vendor that supplies this product. And that's good information to have. But if you're waiting for the month to close and you're kind of always looking back, it's like, well, how can you, where's the real value in that? And as more and more automation comes into play and more of this sort of backward looking reports, when you can just dump data into a system and have it go out and spit out anomalies like, oh, you miscoded these vendor invoices here, so that caused this, a lot of the analysis that we used to do is super easy to do, takes a fraction of the time with computer systems now. So if you're just doing that, then what value are you providing to the company?
Yeah, I like the opening with Glenn, because I thought he did a very good job of stating this is what FP&A is thought to do. We do budgets, we do variance explanations, and gosh, that is so. If you think about it, it's backward looking, it's frozen in time. When you think about it, a lot of people think FP&A are the explainers. We go in and we do variance explanation. We explain why this isn't there and that, we do, but if you look at that, it's a huge problems with it. The biggest problem is the fact that if you're standing on a ship, as I often say, you're standing on the ship looking backwards. You're frozen looking at what has happened versus what you thought was going to happen. Okay. And in both those views, you're looking backwards. And then the reality is, what FP&A is supposed to do is not look backwards, but navigate forward. And so it really sets up. That is just as basic and as simple, and anybody can do that. But it's very, it's very uneventful. It's like the after the sporting event, people talking about, well, they got to this point, and instead of talking about what could happen. Where FP&A adds the most value is in that forward-looking information. So I think you're going to see here as Glenn goes forward, getting into much more useful stuff by getting out of that pass. And you're going to see people still want some degree of understanding of that. But the automation can come in and help with so much of that's what's essentially mundane, repetitive analysis work that's telling you what you probably have an insight on already, instead of focusing and going forward. And that's the big break here is, if you look at the FP&A in the past is this stuff. It's variance explanations. We got to get way past that into much more forward looking. And that's what Glenn talks about as we go forward.
I think that what you need to do going forward is start finding these correlations in the data. And I think about, as you get a handle on the data, the first thing you can do is sort of a descriptive analysis of what's going on. It's like, okay, here's all the information we have. Here's some correlation I found between if a customer calls in for customer service issues 3 times in 1 month, they're more likely to churn off than another customer. So it's like, okay, we understand these are the things that are going on. We understand this is our cash conversion cycle. Great. But then once you get the descriptive part down, well, then let's take it and apply it to the information going forward, and we can start being predictive with that data. So once we find these correlations and we're doing our FP&A, we can look forward and say, whether it's external variables that are driving our models or things that are going on internally or a combination of both, we can start getting better at FP&A because we now have a handle on the data. We know things about our customers. We know things about the overall marketplace, and we're able to better predict, really have more focused FP&A. Well, then once you have that, then you can do what's called prescriptive analytics, where you say, okay, I know that if this customer calls 3 times in, they're very likely to churn. What's a measure we can take to stop them from churning here? So you can start actually driving what's going on in the business going forward. And that's really where I see the value coming. So, when I talk to department heads and they say, oh, well, I want this piece of equipment, this piece of software, to hire this person or whatever. They're not in budget. So I know you're going to say no to that. It's, well, that's sort of the historical idea of the CFO is the CF no, that's always shooting down ideas and just telling people, no, we can't do that because it's not in budget. I think where the strategic value comes in is you're not just saying, no, it's not in the budget. You say, well, okay, it's not in the budget, but let's look at the return on investment. Let's look at the payback. Let's figure out if we need that. And if we do, what's the payback on it? How can we make it work? And how can we, the budget is not as much as our investors and people would certainly like it to be set in stone. I mean, I guess, yes, the budget is set in stone, but you're updating forecasts and there are things that you can do. And if we find something that we didn't see 6 months ago when we made the budget, but now we can, let's not just shoot it down because it's not in the budget. I think that the finance role in the future should be much more hands-on in providing ways that to evaluate based on data if something that's being brought to you is a good idea and how you're going to pay for it and why the company needs it.
Well, I think that is clearly the same kind of negative, backward-looking thinking that we started out his clip with. That, the CFO is the old role is CFO No. If your CFO is known as Dr. No, he's not adding that much value. He may be keeping things totally in control, but he's not taking advantage of what's there. And he better be real good at assumption making, because the only way he's going to know it if he's got the assumptions right. And it's just real hard to be perfect at assumption making. If you are, you probably ought to go to the horse races, or you probably ought to go to the commodity markets, because the reality is the world is just constantly changing. But Glenn gave us some really interesting things there that are kind of the evolution beyond that kind of analytic, initially just recording, if you will, just that basic level of FP&A where we come up with a budget number, and then we go out and we calculate, how are we doing against that number. Instead, the inside of first being descriptive. What do the numbers tell us? And that's where FP&A begins to turn around from being just number crunchers into being people that are helping bring up those insights, bring up that what illuminates. If I understand if a customer calls in 3 times, there's a high likelihood they're going to churn over. That's a useful insight. Not because you could predict. Yes, you can predict, but if you know they're going to turn over, once you start seeing that second or third call, you've got to intervene with that customer. You can prevent that churn if you reach out. So what you're beginning to do is understand, describe what the information is telling you. From that allows you to then predict. And we've talked a lot in other earlier broadcasts about predictive logic diagrams and being able to understand the math of the business, the algorithm, the correlations. But it's not just about predicting, because then you want to get to prescriptive. How do I change the prediction? How do I change? What do I know about intervention so I can prevent that churn? What do I know about that customer retention? So really, it's just that's the evolution that you're seeing that we kind of move through. And Glenn goes through it pretty quickly here, but really, the evolution of CFO is from Dr. CF No, into being somebody that's beyond budget, beyond that rock and stone, and instead realizing that budget or that operational plan that you went in with was based on a bunch of assumptions, based on a bunch of descriptive analytics about how the world worked. And what you're constantly trying to do every day is not just make it work that way, but figure out how to make it work better. Figure out how to avoid the churn. Figure out if you've got that second or third call, what's the intervention that goes in before they leave you to bring them back in terms of what's out there. That's at that point, FP&A is much more forward-looking, prescriptive, helpful to the business, understanding and not doing it on their own. It's not for FP&A to go out and figure all this out. It's for FP&A to work with the business to share those insights and to talk through different things. And then as they talk about different things, to model which way they want to go with everything. So that's how you have to turn it around.
Well, we want to keep things moving for you, Steve. So we're going to jump to our next planning ace, who is Adam Swizicki, CFO of Brex. Now, Brex is another fintech. We've been having a number of fintech finance leaders on the CFO Thought Leader recently, Steve. And Adam was absolutely a standout. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on what he has to share. I will tee it up right now. Again, Adam Swizicki of Brex.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So I think we do actually have a pretty interesting company from a data perspective, because we have the credit card and bank account information for a large swath of startup customers. So we can see in real time the health of those customers, how they're spending, what they're spending on, what is our wallet share, how are those customers using our product across a large variety of touch points that, when you talk about a bank account and credit card, basically touch every employee at the company. And I think that from a data perspective, probably the most interesting evolution or most interesting thing that we've done over the last 6 months or so is really look at, I would say, more of a non-traditional finance metric, which is looking at the value we create for customers. And so when we think about a spend management product and helping companies move faster, which are our goals, we've started to look at things like how much time do employees or managers spend in a review for compliance spend? how many receipts can we auto match for our employees so that they can swipe their card and not do anything afterwards? How much time do we pull out of the system by automating reconciliation of our receipts to a general ledger account? And so all these things add up into dollars, into employee headcount saved, into speed for the company. And we think about what is the value we're creating for our customers. And I think that's really important because number one, that's a goal that isn't really a finance metric. It's something that the whole company can rally around. And engineers and product people or operations folks, they can all focus on increasing that value for the customer. And we want to increase that alignment with our customers. And it's also important for us to think about from a finance perspective when we think about pricing, because we're always making sure we want to be creating value for our customers, pricing at a very large discount to that value we're creating, extracting some of that value for ourselves, but ultimately delivering a lot of ROI for companies that are buying our software products.
Well, I think it's a natural extension from what Glenn talked about. And, you move past being CFO. Now you're helping the business and figure things out. Now, Adam is taking it even further of saying, let me look at a non-financial measure of, can I get insight on how our product serves our customer? In other words, tracking, and they get very specific on not just overall value, but specific elements of the value. Yes, we're going to track our share of their wallet and everything, but we also want to get into understanding how what we do helps the customer, helps save money, helps free up time, helps reduce headcount on their side, helps speed up that company's response. And those are very customer-centric value attributes that they can use and feed to the sales force. They can help enhance the attractiveness of their product. They can look when they propose new programs, new services, what impact that's going to have. And by tracking that all the way through to the customer side, they're validating whether or not their products, how much value it has in ways that they can communicate with the customers. Now, finance is feeding that information to the marketing and the sales force, obviously. But if you're going to feed that out there, you got to have good, hard data to back that up. So again, it's just thinking about it differently. Same FP&A skills that we were using before, but now very much focused on where things are headed in terms of what's out there. And so it's just a very good look at really extending FP&A, you looking at it non-financially and looking at where we're trying to go and really measuring that alignment with the customer. How much better when the more aligned we are with the customer, the more we save that customer, the more we help make them successful, the more successful we're going to be. So it's a really good example following up on the points Glenn was trying to make earlier.
Steve, has FP&A always played a role or contributed to the pricing model or strategy of the company? Is it sometimes separate? Here he's talking about how, pricing that value as we create more value for the customer. How do we price that so we can keep some of the value as well, and they're a satisfied customer because we're discounting that value for them to some degree?
Yeah, well, from my costing days, you're always encouraged. There's always been a cry from the customer, partner with us, generate savings. Okay. But the problem is that if you're generating savings, whatever program you're running, okay, do you give all that to the customer, or you have to save some of that to fund what you're doing? You got to pay for yourself, to keep you in business. There's nothing worse than a partner who gives it all away and therefore has nothing to invest and therefore goes bankrupt because he can't keep himself sustained. So there is this kind of logic that has to be thought through about how much of those savings do I pass the customer? How much do we keep for ourselves? Because that money you keep for yourself is what you're reinvesting in perfecting your services and growing and be able to build more and more capability. So in terms of the pricing function, yes, FP&A sometimes gets drug in, but often it's FP&A if we go back to Glenn's example, if FP&A is doing budget variance explanations because it's a rock and stone and we want to make sure everybody adheres to the rock, all our time gets consumed on gathering the data, make sure we got the right data, calculating the data, looking for those explanations. Again, the more time you spend looking off the back of the boat, the less time you have to spend looking forward. And pricing is one of those ultimate forward-looking decisions. And in Adam's situation, it's not just pricing, but it's also, as we generate savings, what portion of those are we going to give to the customer to enhance our value proposition? What portion do we need to keep for ourselves so we have an investment base? We're making margin, we're making profit, so we can reinvest in our own products and our own services, our own IT and so forth to further enhance those savings. So it's the ultimate part of strategy. And that's where you want to be. The old business is accounting, historical, looking at numbers. The new business is strategic, thinking about the relationships and the value proposition and making them better for your customer and yourself simultaneously, getting to the win-win we're trying to get to. So very contrasting approaches.
So let me ask you my costing question that I mentioned earlier. In regards to pricing and costing, sometimes it sounds like these are used interchangeably. There's an overlap here, or is one umbrellaed under the other?
There's significant overlap, but no, they're not exactly the same thing. Okay. It's very, very important that people have a really good understanding of their cost. And a lot of people don't. A lot of people peanut butter spread and allocate on basis that the way they're spreading their costs have no relation to what's actually causing it. So it's very important that you have a very fundamental understanding of exactly what things cost, even the things that are just arbitrarily allocated. There's some overhead that doesn't relate to everything, but the overhead still has to be understood in the pricing situation. So it's very good that you have a fundamental understanding of costs. The pricing piece is different. The price has to understand, first and foremost, what will the market allow? And that's based on the utility that you provide. In Adam's product, it's what does it save the customer? If he's going to buy my service, what information am I providing that makes that a good buy for him? What am I providing him about his own activities and what's happening that make that a worthy purchase? And so you really have to understand that that's set based on your competitors, based on the, kind of where you fit in that customer's value proposition and so forth. So the price is up here, cost is down here. You have to understand that, because the difference between price and cost is what the margin is. And the margin is the piece that you have to live on in terms of what's out there. And every business is trying to improve its margin, improve its cash flow in terms of what's out there. So they're very closely related to each other, but they're not exactly the same thing.
Well, thank you, Steve, for answering my question. That clarified a few things for sure. Appreciate it. Our next planning ace is Peter Walker, who is CFO of Sterling from episode 822. Again, Peter Walker.
Yeah, maybe I just hover up to kind of my overall people approach, and then I can go into the FP&A specific question. So, whenever you take on a new CFO role, they never hire a new CFO if things are going great, right? So you always know that you're coming in, potentially looking to make some changes. So I use a pretty simple framework of people, process, and technology. So the very first thing I do is I look at my, newly inherited direct reports and quickly assess, do I have the right leaders in the job, right? And depending on that decision, right, let's say that decision is yes, then my, next step is, okay, what are the critical processes that we're focusing on, and what's the technology that we're using to enable those processes? So when I came in and took the Sterling role, I was hired because we knew we were going to eventually IPO, and we were kind of, transforming the organization. So to my surprise, it wasn't really my intent. I ended up replacing my whole senior team within the first 12 months of taking the role. And FP&A specifically was an area that, I leaned heavily into. And I would tell you what I've done, I think uniquely potentially in FP&A is we use RPA in FP&A, and we use technology to the furthest extent possible, right? Because to your point, I just can't afford to have a large FP&A team, and that FP&A team, I want them spending their time really understanding the business and working with business leaders, especially to support the incredible growth we've had. So as much as I can automate the process in FP&A, and like I said, use robotic process automation and use other technologies, that's been, part of our key wins there, I think.
I wanted to stop there because I wanted to kind of catch this point, because what Peter's talking about is a framework that many people use: people, process, and technology. But Peter Peter's been a CFO since 2007. So he has a very deep and long career. So he's really coming from this, this concept, people, process, and technology. And he starts with the people piece first. It echoes back to what Jim Collins wrote in his book, Good to Great. Collins famously said, hey, you got to get the right people on the bus. And so what Peter's talking about starting off with is, hey, I'm in a new company. Let me make sure I've got the right people on the bus. So he's assessing everybody top to bottom. And literally at Sterling, within 12 months, he turned over the entire team. Now, that's a pretty bold move. If you come in and 12 months later, you got a whole new crew. If you're working there and the boss starts turning everybody over, you get pretty nervous. So, I mean, there's some risk in that aggressive of an approach. But I got to conclude, if you've done this many times, you kind of know what you're looking for. But he starts with people, and then the rest of his clip, he's going to talk about process and technology. So I just want to first set up that this is a cautionary tale for everybody in FP&A. Make sure you're doing the things in your career, and listen to this podcast is a good way to do it. Make sure you're learning the things in your career to make sure that you're one of the right people, that you know where FP&A is headed, that you know what's the evolution going to be. You know what you're trying to do, but you also know where you're headed with all this kind of stuff. And we're going to pick up some good lessons in the back half of this as well. But I just want to stop there and make that point to echo what Jim Collins said. Get the right people on the bus.
So let me start with the mundane that turned into strategic, because I always find those to be the most interesting. So one of the things I discovered in my, first, caught 3 months into this role is, we are a large user of data, right? In order to complete the background screening processes for our clients, we need to gather data from across the globe and put that data together in a very meaningful way. What I came to find out is that the process for ensuring that we were paying for the proper data that we were using was, very antiquated and manual, right? So this invoice review process related to a significant amount of cost was just a really manual process. So I went into it and I thought, okay, how can I, automate this? Because this is not where I want my finance team spending their time reconciling invoices. So the thought was we've got API integrations with all of these data providers, and that's why we're able to deliver most of our criminal background checks in the U.S. in less than a day because of this technology. So I said, okay, let me use this technology to actually add some data fields so that I can do automatic reconciliation using RPA. For a CFO, that might sound kind of exciting. For a CEO, they're like, okay, great, tell me something more interesting, right? So then the next piece that I thought about is, in that current state, I did not have visibility into my gross margin by client. So while I priced a client deal, I didn't know how much I was actually making on the client deal once their program was in place. So the other thing that I did was, in the API integration with the data providers, is I tagged the actual client in that API, and then I created the automation on the back end so that I was able to not only, save hundreds of hours in invoice reconciliation that's a totally non-value added activity to an organization, but I was also able to create client level P&Ls that now I can sit down with my business leaders and have a conversation around, we priced a client at X and they're operating at Y. That can either be positive or negative. And what do we want to do about this? So I was able to take something and really turn it into a strategic tool that we're using to run the business today.
Well, I like what Peter talks about there. Really, it uses two different aspects of robotic product automation. I got to tell you, Jack, with FP&A, RPA, SPNA, we are in a podcast full of acronyms, so I apologize to our readers there. But robotic automation is really just using the computer to do what we have to do manually. And as he points out, having human eyes look and reconcile two documents when a computer can do it so much quicker, so much faster, so much more completely, it's just a task that begs for automation. And a lot of people are happy with just grabbing that, eliminating that manual task and declaring victory and going home. And so, yes, it does reduce the cost and it frees up a lot of eyeballs to go do more high value added things. But Peter's a little bit smarter about it. He takes that same thing and he's really thinking through, well, can I not only get that automation done, but can I also track? So as I'm doing that automation, I also get me a little bit more information to put the customer name on there as well, so I can then do real-time margin calculations. So he's thinking through, not only can I do that, can I also track the cost of what that's costing me to do that, so that I really see how I'm going on a margin kind of approach. And so, yes, the pricing strategic stuff you still got to think through, but it's so much easier when you have a detailed understanding of exactly what each item was on the cost side. So again, he's taking that step forward, and that's what we got to be looking for as we think about our automation. Not just get the manual stuff out of the way. Yeah, there's a huge benefit for that. But what else could we do since we're already doing it to get us a whole lot better information? Then when we have a pricing decisions are a whole lot easier when you really understand everything you're doing and the true cost of what you're doing. If I understand all this, I know what I've got to price it for now in terms of what's out there. So I thought this was a beautiful illustration, not just of RPA eliminating manual work, but RPA leading us to better information in terms of where we're going. And that's where we're really going with it, with the financial planning analysis, is that deeper analysis to better inform our decisions.
Well, we are up to our fourth planning ace, Steve, who is David Bedell, CFO of Lendio. Now, David was back at episode 818, and he had this great expression. He talked about how finance needs to break the glass wall. He says there's a sort of for too long, finance executives, finance leaders have stood behind this glass wall and haven't sort of asserted themselves into strategic discussions, haven't brought certain numbers forward and revealed what they might be impacting. Again, greater assertiveness and playing a greater role in strategy, breaking the glass wall. Anyway, Steve, CFO David Bedell.
You've probably heard this from a lot of people. I think that FP&A has evolved since I started in it, where now the best FP&A people aren't true FP&A people. They're a hybrid of like these data centric, really good in SQL and Excel and being able to manipulate data, because your job as a finance person isn't just the financials. That's the table stakes. Your job in finance is to provide insight. A lot of times the best insight isn't from NetSuite. The best insights from your production system and all the data there. And so you've got to be able to span both worlds. And the people that I think do the worst are the ones that limit themselves and see their job as just the financials, because the job of finance is decision making, not to do the financials. And once you get that grasp that that's the real job, a lot of people do much better. The biggest thing I think that when I became CFO, I realized is you absolutely cannot do everything. Most CFOs come up through path A, path B, or path C, accounting, kind of more strategic, or FP&A or something like that. You can't be the all-star in that job as well as do the CFO job. You have to have people under you that do those jobs. So the first thing I did when I went over to HireVue was hire an amazing FP&A person that had worked for me before, because I knew if I just kept doing FP&A, I was just going to get sucked in and never be as good of a well-rounded CFO as I had to be. So it's getting those right people under you. And truly, the way I phrase it is, I have to delegate with the fear of failure. If I don't truly have the possibility that they can fail, I'm not truly delegating. And so I have to make sure the people under me really have that responsibility. And if they fail, I fail, but they truly have to have that ability to fail.
David gave us kind of a short pair of paragraphs here. The first paragraph here is really, to me, is a mantra for people in FP&A. That really FP&A is increasingly becoming a world where it's not just about, being a financial person or kind of crunching numbers, crunching budgets and things like that. You really got to have the ability to be a data analyst, a data gatherer, somebody who really knows their way around data, how I bring it together, how I transform it, how I put it together in the ways I need to look at it. And when you really look at it, it's really to use David's words, a person that spans both worlds. And if you're going to be an FP&A, you need to be studying, what do I have to do to really understand how to span both worlds? And that's because the information we really need doesn't just reside in the financial statements. It doesn't just reside in the general ledger. The general ledger is a summary of financial transactions, but you can't understand any of it unless you get behind what created it. It's what the founder of the firm I used to work for, Arthur Anderson, said back before we ever founded the firm. The only way you understand a business is not by understanding the numbers, but by understanding what's behind the numbers, the physical things that cause the transactions to occur. And to get insight on that, you're reaching out to the ERP system. You're reaching out to the CRM system, the customer relationship management system, in terms of what's out there. You're reaching out to the other things that tell you the physical things that are going on in the business. And the ability to grab that data and apply it into your algorithms makes FP&A so much richer, so much more telling. Back to what we started this podcast with, making it descriptive to you and describe what's happening in the business, making it predictive. So when you see that stuff happening, you can predict where it's going to go, and making it ultimately prescriptive. So you can begin to say, what do we do to change that to make it better? Because at the end of the day, as David talked about there, I'll quote him directly here, the job of finance is decision-making, not do the financials. I have spoken to so many people in finance who feel like their job is to produce the financial statements. Their job is to produce an income statement, a balance sheet, a cash flow, as if that is the product. I know no customers buying income statements, balance sheets, or cash flow. They're buying your products and services. And so what you really have to do is support your whole job. The only reason you do those statements is to understand decision-making. And so that's kind of really key to that piece of thing. And I think it's a point we all need to focus on. It's the financial, it's the non-financial, it's the whole package. And the FP&A person is the one that can pull all that together and present it in a way that tells the story and helps people understand and helps support the decisions. It gives the analysis so people can make decisions. The second half, when David went to the second half, that's, the second quote is I always like these things, Jack, because I learn a lot. And this is one I really, you'd sent 4 quotes over. So I'd listened to 4 hours of CFO testimonies and everything before then after the clips. But this one to me was some of the most powerful stuff we've had in a long time. And David's talking about what's happening when he's working with things. The CFO can't do all jobs. The FP&A manager can't do all jobs. This is a message for every person trying to lead a financial organization or any organization. If you're trying to do everything, you will fail. Because by its nature, the job is bigger than a person. The person that's really going to win is the one that's going to go out and hire amazing people to fill the key roles. And as the quote there, if you don't truly have the possibility that they can fail, then you're not truly delegating. I want you to think about that. They have to have the possibility of failing. If they can't fail, then you haven't truly delegated. And you have to make sure that they have that responsibility, and that if they fail, then you fail. But that's what delegation really is. It's really, you set them up to be successful, but you've empowered them, in terms of what's out there. So I think I'd ask everybody just to study that in terms of when you're working with your teams. Have you really given them the possibility to truly be successful and to fail? And are you willing to, do you trust them enough to take that ride with them? Because that's what we're trying to get to. That's what we're trying to do with the podcast, is give our listeners the possibility to succeed, which also means you've got the possibility of failing, and to have the courage to be able to take on that challenge and be successful.
And it echoes the earlier planning ace about getting the right people on the bus. He circles back to Jim Collins.
Well, if you come back to the thing, I mean, if I'm going to get the right people on the bus, I want the people that I can trust, that I'm willing to give the authority to, that I'm willing to say, okay, that they have the authority to go out and fail if they have to. Okay, if that's I have that point made sure I've got a lot of trust in them. If you think about it, underneath that whole thing is a high degree of trust. And trust is both, did I pick the right people, and did I equip them and train them and give them the tools that they need to be successful. And that underlies the whole thing in terms of what's out there. So I think it pulls together nicely there.
I'd agree. A nice episode for Steve. Thank you. This is where I get to ask you where you headed, what you doing, what's shaking out there, Steve. What's on the calendar?
Well, I'm very excited, Jack. Two things. One, we've announced some training that we're going to be offering here to the general public. We're starting with two different sets of courses. Each one have a webcast followed by a 2-hour session. So the first coming up on September 29th, we're going to be focusing on impactful reports. And so we've got a webcast of 7 steps to creating more impactful reports on September 29th. That's then followed by the workshop for that, which will be on November 2nd and 4th. 2-hour workshops, 2 halves, there'll be 4 parts all together, 200 minutes of instruction, really showing you how to build those reports. And we're talking about getting away from columns and columns of numbers that are making everybody blind into reports that really tell a story, reports that really move forward. And we'll be exploring how your brain works and why we want to change reporting to fit the way your brain works. The other segment really focuses on change management. We'll start with a webcast on Thursday, the 13th of October, on understanding change management, because it is key to any management system, because the management system has to deal with a dynamic world that we live in. And do that means you've got to be adjusting. Everybody's trying to build something, but then build it better. So that always requires a constant change. So we're going to be looking at the principles of change, looking at what real companies have done. Our change methodology, we'll look at the theories, but we'll talk about real companies and how they've been applied, because I think that's what helps people. And then after that webcast, we'll follow that up on November 14th and 16th. We'll have 2-hour sessions each of those days. 2 on the 14th, 2 hours on the 14th, 2 on the 16th, focusing on multiple ways to create positive change. And we'll go into those specific techniques and show you not only how each one's what it's focused on, but also how to punch in combination, because your really power is punching in combination. And we'll give you the breadth of what different companies did, so that each participant will begin to learn, how can I take these tools and figure out which ones to apply in my situation and my specific efforts to change? Because if you're going to be effective in finance, you've got to be a change enabler. And that's what these things are for. So I'm excited about all that. And then live training, you and I will be together in Philadelphia coming up toward the end of October. We're going to be at the AFP's annual conference in Philadelphia this year. So looking forward to being live with you at that.
Can they reach out to you, Steve, or what would you like interested parties to do?
Easiest way is to just send me an email, steve@theplayergroup.com. Again, steve@theplayergroup, THEPLAYERGROUP, steve@theplayergroup.com. Just drop me a line and I'll send you all the details of the agenda and those kind of things. But would love to have our listeners jump in and start getting more specific on how you can become more enabled to be a planning ace.
Well, I guess that's our episode, Steve. For Planning Aces, this is Jack Sweeney with Steve Player. Thank you for listening.